Hi everyone, my name's Laura Fernley and I'll be giving a talk entitled Moral Worth, Right Reasons and Counterfactual Motives. So whether an action is morally praiseworthy depends not just on whether it's the morally right thing to do, it also needs to be motivated in the appropriate way. And an account of moral worth aims to identify the content of these appropriate motives. In this talk, I'm interested in one particular account of moral worth. According to this account, morally worthy actions are right actions which are performed in response to the relevant moral reasons, that is, the reasons making the action right. I call this the right reason thesis. And the central idea behind this doctrine is that moral worth is not about doing something right because it is right, rather it's about doing something right for the reasons which make it right. My talk has two ambitions today. The first is to demonstrate that RRT is not quite as successful as contemporary discussions would appear to suggest, and that's because the view fails to satisfy two important desiderata that are associated with theories of moral worth. The first I've called degrees. Does a theory of moral worth ought to identify the extent to which actions deserve praise or blame? And the second is overdetermination. It says a theory of moral worth ought to tell us if right actions produced from overdetermined motives have moral worth. So that's the first aim. And the second is to persuade you that RRT can satisfy these two desiderata when the theory is supplemented with a counterfactual framework. And supplementing RRT with a counterfactual framework entails that when assessing an action's moral worth, we not only consider whether the agent is responsive to the right sorts of reasons in the actual world, but also whether she's responsive to these moral reasons in nearby possible worlds. So I'm calling right reason thesis plus the counterfactual framework the counterfactual right reason thesis. And to clarify, my aim isn't really to defend RRT. Rather, my aim is to say, look, if you're already an advocate of RRT, then you have strong reasons to adopt the counterfactual version instead. Not only does an appeal to counterfactuals provide a more successful theory of moral worth by satisfying these two desiderata, it does so in a way that's uniquely unified and intuitive. So the plan for today, I'll just introduce RRT and CRRT in more detail, and then I'll turn to look at the desiderata. So the right reason thesis. Recent variations of the right reason thesis have been defended by both Nomi Arpley and Julia Markowitz. This is what Arpley says. For an agent to be morally praiseworthy for doing the right thing is for her to have done the right thing for the relevant moral reasons. That is, the reasons for which she acts are identical to the reasons for which the action is right. And similarly, Markowitz writes, my action is morally worthy if and only if my motivating reasons for acting coincide with the reasons morally justifying the action. That is, if and only if I perform the action I morally ought to perform for the normative reasons why it morally ought to be performed. So to illustrate the view, consider Kant's grumpy shopkeeper who charges his inexperienced customers a fair price because it secures higher profits. And Kant's shopkeeper does something morally right. But RRT correctly says that he doesn't warrant any moral credit for doing the right thing because he's not motivated in the appropriate way. In order to be praiseworthy, he would have to charge his customers a fair price for the reason that doing so is right, presumably for considerations of fairness or justice, or out of considerations for the economic welfare of his customers, something like that. So moral praise requires doing the right thing for the right sorts of reasons. And something similar is true of blameworthy actions. So when an agent does wrong and does so through insufficiently responding to moral reasons, the action warrants blame. And insufficiency can manifest itself either by a failure to respond to the moral reasons, or by responding to what Arpley calls sinister reasons, which essentially conflict with morality. So one can fail to respond to the right sorts of reasons by doing wrong through, for example, failing to recognize that your action will upset another person, whilst acting in response to sinister reasons entails acting wrongly because one wishes to upset the other person. And although it's only in this latter case that one acts intentionally with intention to be vicious, you're nonetheless blameworthy in both cases. And RRT has attracted many contemporary sponsors, and I suspect a large part of the account's appeal is its ability to accommodate for this highly intuitive constraint, which says that morally praiseworthy actions are non-accidentally right? They're not right by luck. I've called this a non-accidentality constraint after Jessica Isero. And we've already seen evidence of this constraint. So when Kant's shopkeeper charges his customers a fair price, he does the right thing only by accident. Given that his economic motive is not connected to the morality of his action, it's a matter of luck that his desire for profit leads him to do something morally desirable. Right? His motive could have easily pushed him in another direction. But by stipulating that one ought to perform an action for the reasons it ought to be performed, RRT demands this tight connection between motives and morality, which avoids us praising actions which are only right by luck. And the importance of this constraint cannot be understated. We might think of it as like the foundational desideratum for a theory of moral worth. But despite its strengths in this respect, I'm going to show you that RRT doesn't have the resources to meet different kinds of desiderata. But before I do that, I'm just going to very briefly introduce the counterfactual version. And it will be brief because hopefully as we go along, you'll see what a fully fledged account will look like. For now, I'll say that CRRT maintains the right reason thesis, in so much as praise requires doing well for the right reasons, and blame requires doing badly through insufficiently responding to the right reasons. But unlike RRT, CRRT demands that the agent not only be responsive or unresponsive to such reasons in the actual world, but that they continue to be responsive or unresponsive in a range of nearby possible worlds. Accordingly, we can think of this counterfactual view as stipulating a kind of threshold for moral worth. So you have to meet a threshold by being responsive or unresponsive to the moral features in so many worlds before your action can be a candidate for praise or blame. Okay, introductions out the way, let's go to degrees. So sometimes two actions which are equal in their moral desirability may be of different moral worth. So for example, we may say that Jane is more to blame for her cruel remark than John is for his equally cruel remark, on the grounds that John has recently suffered a bereavement and is under a lot of emotional strain. Now, as it stands, RRT does not discriminate between John and Jane because it treats moral worth as a binary concept. Either you have it or you don't have it. But a successful theory won't have this implication, right? A successful theory will tell us the extent to which an action has moral worth. And in this section, I'm going to present Markowitz's revised proposal, which attempts to capture degrees of moral worth. So she supplies an extension to RRT, which captures degrees of praise and blame. And I'll give you two reasons why I don't think it completely satisfies the desideratum. It should also be noted that Naomi Arpley, another defender of RRT, also supplies conditions to meet more degrees. But due to time constraints, I'm just going to talk about Markowitz, but happy to talk about Arpley in the comment section. Okay, so in order to satisfy degrees, Markowitz combines RRT with an appraiser relative approach to moral worth. How much praise or blame an action is owed depends upon how we, as appraisers, relate to the action under review. So in regards to maximally praiseworthy actions, Markowitz says, a heroic action is a right action of some moral significance that most of us judging the action would not have had the moral strength to perform had we been in the hero's place. And the same goes for maximally blameworthy actions. So these are wrong actions which are performed through an insufficient response to the right reasons that most of us doing the judging would not have done had we been in the wrongdoer's shoes. So maximal praise and blame, we have RRT here, and then we go to consider whether we would have done that had we been in the agent's place, and if most of us would not have, it's maximally praiseworthy or blameworthy. So under this proposal, the extent to which an action deserves moral worth is relative. It's relative to a community of appraisers. The more unusual it would be for that action to occur, the more admiration or derision it deserves. But of course, there can be disagreements amongst the community, right? So I might judge Fireman Sam here to be a hero because I wouldn't have risked my life had I been in Fireman Sam's shoes. But his colleagues might reject the label. They might say, no, he's only doing his job. He's not really a hero. And Markowitz suggests that when this type of speaker disagreement happens, that both speakers are right. It's appropriate, or it could be appropriate, to label Fireman Sam a hero and not a hero at the same time. And she thinks this is the case because it reflects our linguistic practices, right? It's descriptively true. This is how we go about making moral assessments. And this will become important in a minute. So Markowitz provides an interesting extension, I think, to RRT, but I have two worries. So the first is that I don't think it completely satisfies the desideratum. So she gives us the resources to identify maximal praise and maximal blame, but what of behavior that falls short of these two extremes? At the moment, a lot of more commonplace behavior is going uncodified under the view. Now, a friend could try and extend the account to capture this more commonplace behavior. For instance, one could say that if a heroic action, right, a maximally praiseworthy action, is one that most people judging the action would not have the moral strength to perform themselves, perhaps a considerably praiseworthy action, which just falls short of heroism, is one that nearly most of us would not have the moral strength to perform themselves. So this method kind of aggregates moral appraisals to find a kind of mean, and the mean corresponds to degrees of moral worth. And we can do the same for blame as well. But it's not obvious to me that we can aggregate moral appraisals in this way, in virtue of the account's appraiser relativism. For recall that if two speakers disagree about whether an action is heroic or not heroic, then the action itself is appropriately described as both heroic and not heroic. Consequently, we can't smudge together moral appraisals to work out a mean, right? We can't take heroic and not heroic to get almost heroic. The action is just both heroic and not heroic at the same time. Now, my second worry is perhaps a deeper worry, and it concerns whether the appraiser relative approach captures praise and blame worthiness. So on Markowitz's view, an action is more praiseworthy relative to an appraiser, and this means that degrees of moral worth depends upon how an appraiser stands in relation to the action. However, typically moral worth, whether one actually deserves praise or blame, is considered to be a feature of an action which goes above and beyond standing relations. To my mind, the extent to which an action genuinely deserves praise or blame comes regardless of one's judgments at particular times and particular places. Now, this is a topic that's probably beyond the scope of the paper. Someone could just come back and say, actually, no, degrees of moral worth is relativized in this way, and the standing relation tracks this nicely. Someone could make that response, and I feel like it's a discussion that I can't really get into here. But still, I think it would be difficult for someone to make this kind of response whilst being an advocate of the right reason thesis. This is because the right reason thesis supplies conditions for moral worth simpliciter which do not relativize the phenomena. Whether one is praiseworthy or blameworthy is independent of subjective judgments and beliefs at particular times and places. Hence, if one wanted to advocate for both the right reason thesis and this appraiser relative approach to degrees of moral worth, I think some story has to be told as to why degrees of moral worth is relativized, but moral worth simpliciter is not relativized. And in the absence of such an explanation, I think we should be cautious about pushing these two views together. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at CRRT. So I think a solution to degrees can be found by going back to basics and looking at this core constraint on moral worth, right? The foundational desideratum, the non-accidentality constraint. So recall that moral worth simpliciter depends upon whether an action was brought about through luck. If it's accidentally right, then it's not a candidate for moral worth. It's reasonable to suppose then that the degree of moral worth depends upon the degree to which the action was brought about through luck. And one way to capture luck involved in action is by considering how the agent would have acted in various counterfactual scenarios. If the agent would continue to do well in a broad range of counterfactuals, then she doesn't rely on luck to do the right thing. If, on the other hand, the agent fails to do well in lots of alternative scenarios, then it shows that they did require luck to do well in the actual world, right? They needed certain circumstances to obtain for them to do the right thing. And one easy way to think about this is through motivational strength, right? If you have a very strong praiseworthy motive, you're going to do well in lots of counterfactual scenarios. If you have quite a fragile motive, then you'll do well in fewer counterfactual scenarios. So the amount of moral worth awarded, I suggest, is proportionate to the robustness of one's motive, and how robust an agent's motive is acts as a proxy for something far more substantial, how much the action is a product of accidentality. And I think this is quite a nice solution to degrees insofar as it's like theoretically simple. We just build on this foundational desideratum, and it seems intuitively right to me as well. So here's a good place to take stock. When I introduced CRT, I said it made moral worth into a threshold concept, right? You have to respond to the right sorts of reasons, not only in the actual world, but also in a range of nearby worlds in order to gain moral worth simpliciter. And combining this with what I've said about degrees, it follows that once an agent has met this threshold, we can move to ask how many other worlds she would do well in. The more worlds she would do well in, the more praise she deserves. And we can do the same for blame as well. So going on to the second desideratum, overdetermination. So in this section, I'm going to tell you that the right reason thesis is committed to a claim about overdetermined actions which is problematic. And the counterfactual view is committed to a different claim about overdetermined actions which is not problematic and therefore better satisfies the desideratum. So I reserve the term overdetermination for cases in which one has two or more independent motives for acting, and each of these motives is sufficient to bring about the action. So had one not been present, the agent would have acted anyway. And the category of overdetermined actions which poses a problem for theories of moral worth are those in which one of the motives is a praiseworthy one and the other is not. So for us, it's going to be a problem when someone is motivated in response to the right sorts of reasons, and they have another motive which is not this, right? Which is perhaps a self-interested motive. And the question is, are we morally praiseworthy when we have this motivational structure? So here's an example to illustrate. Suppose a politician volunteers at a food bank. She has two motives for doing so. It's in her career interest to be seen volunteering, and she desires to relieve the suffering of those less fortunate than herself. Now, supposing that the second motive constitutes doing something right in response to the right reasons, are we to say then that the politician is praiseworthy for volunteering at the food bank? Now, to my mind, RRT is going to have to say yes, the politician is praiseworthy, because all you have to do to get moral worth, according to the account, is do the right thing in response to the right sorts of reasons. And this is what the politician does, right? Nothing in the account precludes us from praising actions which are overdetermined like this. So as it stands, I think RRT is committed to a claim like this: all motivationally overdetermined actions have moral worth, if and only if at least one of the motives was a response to the right sorts of reasons. However, it's been pointed out by Barbara Herman that endorsing all is problematic, and it's problematic because we would end up praising actions which are only right by accident. So this is what Herman says. As circumstances change, we may expect the actions the two motives require to be different and at times incompatible. Then an agent might not have a moral motive capable of producing a required action by itself, if his presently cooperating non-moral motives were instead in conflict with the moral motive. That is, an agent could, in different circumstances, act contrary to duty from the same configuration of moral and non-moral motives that in the fallacious circumstances led him to act morally. So to clarify Herman's point here, let's consider the politician again. So the politician is motivated to volunteer from these two motives. Is she praiseworthy? Or possibly not, says Herman, because the fact that she volunteers in this world from these motives is compatible with the thought that if these two motives were no longer in cooperation, right, they were no longer pushing in the same direction, she might fail to act rightly. And we can easily imagine scenarios in which these two motives are combative rather than cooperative. So suppose that on the day she's scheduled to volunteer, the press cancel last minute, so there's no fancy photo shoot, it's not in her career interest. Now, if she doesn't act well in this press cancelling world, then when she does act well in the actual world, we know it's only because the two motives cooperated in the way they did. And the reason these two motives cooperate in the way they did is because certain fortuitous circumstances obtained at the time. When the politician volunteers in the actual world, then, it's not because of a robust, healthy, praiseworthy motive. Rather, it's because certain accidental circumstances obtained which made the two motives cooperate. and thus we see her action as somewhat accidental. So in light of this, I think we have reasons to reject all or to amend an account which implies all. Whilst the claim does meet overdetermination, it does so at the risk of violating a far more important desideratum on moral worth, the non-accidentality constraint. A better option, I think, is some. It says some motivationally overdetermined actions are compatible with moral worth. In particular, it's going to be the actions which do not violate the non-accidentality constraint. And in what remains, I'm just going to briefly tell you how CRRT meets some. So recall that CRRT says that a right action has moral worth if it's done in response to the right reasons in this world, and if the agent will continue to respond to these reasons in a range of nearby possible worlds. And then to look at degrees, we consider how many additional worlds the agent would act well in once they've passed this threshold. So how does CRRT satisfy some? Well, simply in virtue of this first condition concerning moral worth simpliciter. By meeting this condition, we can be sure that the action does not violate the non-accidentality constraint. Why? Well, because if an agent has a praiseworthy motive robust enough, such that they would do well in a range of possible worlds, then their actually doing well was not the product of accidental circumstances, which fosters cooperation between the praiseworthy and non-praiseworthy motive. On the other hand, if the praiseworthy motive is fragile enough to the extent that it could easily be overridden by the non-praiseworthy motive in most nearby worlds, then the agent's actually doing well was evidently the result of the cooperation of the two motives, right? And the reason they cooperate is because of accidental circumstances, and so they shouldn't deserve any moral credit. Okay, so I'm going to briefly conclude, say that I've argued that supplementing RRT with a counterfactual framework allows the view to satisfy important desiderata associated with theories of moral worth, thereby providing a more successful account of blame and praiseworthiness. Okay, thank you.